What follows is an analysis of Jaws from 1975. If you've not seen it, then what the hell are you doing here? Bookmark the video, go watch it, then come back. This video will spoil the whole film, since I'll be going into detail practically scene for scene, so massive spoilers, you have been warned. New Jersey, 1916. 4 people were killed by one shark on a New Jersey shoreline. The great white shark was eventually caught and killed. 15 pounds of undigested human remains were found in its stomach. This extremely rare event would inspire the writer Peter Benchley to write a novel. Prior to publishing, the manuscript found its way to the studio offices of Universal, where a young, talented filmmaker would pick it up to read and decide he wanted to make it as his next film. Of course, today, we all know the name Steven Spielberg, unless we've been living under a rock. In 1974, though, while a recognised talent under contract at Universal Studios, you would be forgiven for not recognising his name. Until now, most of his work had been in TV, directing episodes of Rod Serling's Night Gallery, the first episode of Columbo when it became a series, and a couple of TV movies. Most prominently 1971's Duel, which would get a European cinema release because it was simply that good. Duel told the story of a man in a life and death fight against an anonymous truck driver who seems hell-bent on his destruction. David Mann must, man up in his fight against this Goliath truck, overcoming his own inadequacies to win the day. The parallels between David Mann and the protagonist of Jaws, Chief Martin Brody, should be obvious to anyone who's seen both films. The man versus a seemingly unstoppable force storyline is also an obvious parallel. Jaws replaces the truck with a shark, essentially. It was Spielberg himself that came up with the idea that the shark would be mechanical, having been impressed by the work of Bob Matty, who was responsible for the giant squid effects in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It was also Spielberg's perhaps naive idea to film on the actual ocean. Not in shallow water, not in some studio tank as was the tradition, but out at sea. These two decisions would create a nightmare shoot, push the budget far beyond what was agreed, almost result in the firing of Spielberg, but lead to two of the film's most creative strengths. The second I will mention a little later, but for now let's start with that which is demonstrated in the very first scene. Contrary to popular belief, it was always the intention of Spielberg to hide the shark from our view for a large portion of the film. Like I've said before, we are much more frightened by what we don't see than what we do. The mechanical shark malfunctioning in the salt water of the ocean just increased his use of this technique. We won't actually see the shark until over 1 hour into the film. The shark will be represented from its point of view for a number of scenes. From out of the depths we will journey for the opening scene, passengers in its eyes. John Williams' amazing score would imply its menacing presence. Contrasting this beautifully is the scene around a campfire on the beach that follows, when we cut from a dark scene with foreboding music to the brightly lit campfire scene with harmonicas and guitars playing more uplifting music. Moving from the subjective to the objective, it isn't long before the proximity of the water is established when Tom approaches Chrissy on the beach. Off they run to the water's edge with Chrissy entering the water. 2 brief close-ups of Chrissy and a couple of shots of her swimming from beneath are the calm before the storm we will soon witness. Finally, she stops and treads water. Then we get the shark's point of view, with Williams' score cluing us in that it is the shark's point of view and not just another shot from beneath. Imagine this shot silent as you're seeing it now. Would that dread we feel build without the music? I'd argue no. It is important to appreciate the pivotal role that the score plays in this film, particularly when it comes to representing the shark. It is also important to appreciate the role the actress's reactions play to make this scene more terrifying. There's no blood in this scene, no gore effects, and no view of the attacking shark. Implying injuries is often more dreadful than showing them, as it suggests that whatever is out of sight is too horrifying for us to cope with, opening it up to the interpretation of our imagination, which may well make them worse than could ever have been represented visually. The actress was dragged back and forth by a rope tied around her waist that men on the beach were pulling one way and then another. She is finally pulled into a close-up so we can see her expression of pure terror just before she is dragged underwater, which I understand Spielberg did himself to time correctly. The remaining element in this scene is when we momentarily cut back to Tom, oblivious to her predicament from his position on the beach. Hitchcock was fond of setting suspenseful, sometimes horrifying scenes in public places by placing the events within an environment where they might be witnessed, and yet our potential witnesses are not aware of those events. This increases the involvement in the scene as we almost will those who don't notice to look in this direction. So we graphic match to the next scene, where we will be introduced to our protagonist. After a brief reference to the idea that they are not from where they are, we cut to the kitchen scene where Brody's son enters the kitchen presenting a bleeding hand. The next shot is brilliant. While Brody is answering the phone and presumably discussing the missing girl with someone, his wife is washing blood off their son's hand while he's asking about going swimming. This, of course, immediately raises a red flag in our mind, having witnessed the death of Chrissy. How Brody is framed to the right of the frame with no looking space also makes the shot feel awkward. Traditionally, characters look into frame. They have looking space. So whenever they're squeezed to one side of the frame like this, looking out of the frame, it naturally feels awkward to we, the viewer. This scene also introduces a staple of Spielberg's style that he uses until this very day, and that is overlapping dialogue.
Yeah, but let me clean this thing off first.
What do they usually do? Wash
I just want
out
to make sure you don't go past
what?
In the very next scene, after we are informed that Brody is police and he passes by a billboard where a girl who looks not unlike our first victim ironically grins back at us, we are introduced to another frequent Spielberg trope, that where the reactions of one or more characters are held on prior to revealing what they're reacting to. You might remember this scene from Jurassic Park, where Grant and Malcolm spot something. Grant stands removing his sunglasses, turns the head of Ellie to alert her of what he sees. She turns, then stands in awe, removing his sunglasses, all before we cut to what they're looking at. This builds our anticipation for the reveal, whether to inspire dread in us, as in Jaws, or awe in us, as in Jurassic Park, intensifying the effect of the reveal. Right after the reveal of Chrissy's remains, as though that wasn't enough, we are introduced to yet another staple of Spielberg's style. This scene in a police station, aside from one insert, is performed in a single shot. This is a long take, also known as a one-er, and usually requires substantial blocking and rehearsal. This film is peppered by one-ers, and you may well ask, why go to all this trouble for what is a basic scene? Why not simply cut around the scene in a conventional manner? Is this Spielberg just showing off? Actually, there's two reasons that I can think of. First of all, actors tend to work better with whole scenes rather than breaking it into short snippets of their performance. Their actions flow better. The second more prominent reason in this case relates to editing. Many of the more dramatic scenes that follow later will rely on quick-fire editing to lift the pace and intensify the drama. Now, had we been cutting back and forth in a traditional editing style leading up to the point where the editing quickens, the effect of that quickening would have been dampened. It is the contrast between these two editing styles that makes the editing so much more effective. While cuts are made more frequently once Brody leaves the police station and heads for the store to introduce new characters, the scene in the store is then another one-er. This slow editing style continues from the scene where Brody speaks to Hendricks to the scene on the barge when the mayor catches up with Brody. Look how Brody is positioned in this scene, how he is pressed up against the left of the frame, visually reinforcing how all the other characters are essentially ganging up on him. Then see three different shots realised, the actors moving closer to the camera as the scene develops, the shot finally finishing on the close-up of Brody and Mayor Vaughn. Moving the actors towards and away from the camera in order to achieve different shot sizes is also more time economical than repositioning the camera. In the opening shot of the next scene, again a well-blocked one-er, we are introduced to both victims. We even learn the boy's full name, immediately personalising him in our minds. The scene cuts around to various activity before we cut back to Brody watching the water. Spielberg uses what is called an axial cut to immerse us more in Brody's perspective. It's a technique of presenting the same shot moving closer and closer. There are only 3 films that I know of Spielberg's that use this technique. One was Duel, one was Jaws, and one was E.T. Here the cuts closer are covered neatly by extras crossing the frame, as are the cuts back and forth as Brody reacts to the first red herring. When a man moves over to Brody to have a conversation, he is framed again very awkwardly on the right of the frame. This is a split diopter shot, where the foreground and background are in focus despite the telephoto lens. Most people watching this scene for the first time miss what he says entirely. Aside from our eyes Naturally focusing on a left of the frame given a focus choice, that we share Brody's anxiety makes the man's words irrelevant. This is a similar shot, but notice that this is a wider shot from behind Brody's head instead of the person he is speaking to being squashed against the right of the frame. He is more centered, implying Brody is calmer than before he reacted to the second red herring. So as Brody is further relaxed by his wife moving around to massage his shoulders, we disconnect from his perspective. While he is relaxed, our anxiety levels don't drop as we cut to kids screaming playfully in the water. Then the dog's stick, floating freely, implies our worst fears are coming true. This is Spielberg at his most vicious. To kill off a dog and a child in the same scene, I doubt he would do something like that today. Now the familiar ominous music cue hits as we approach Alex Kintner from beneath. Assuming we've been paying attention, we know it's him since he is the only character who has been presented on a raft. In the screenplay, the death of Alex Kintner is more discovered than shown, a series of characters reacting to blood in the water, eventually alerting Brody. I haven't really talked about the screenplay much. I did read it, but frankly it almost put me to sleep, as I knew it would, aware as I was before reading how much of the dialogue was cut back or improvised by the actors. How Spielberg presented Alex Kintner's death was visceral by comparison to how I think any death of a child would be presented on screen today. A huge plume of blood erupting from the water, the child being dragged down, his arms flailing. It's the stuff of nightmares. Immediately following this stomach-churning moment is this dolly zoom on Brody. Often it is not the contrast between emotions on either side of the cut, but two or more shots coagulating into a more effective mix. Spielberg both sickens and shocks us by juxtaposing these moments. Incidentally, that dolly zoom shot would not have worked so well without Brody's wife being behind him, adding depth to the image. So, at the town meeting, the framing of Brody is once again at the edge of the frame when addressing the townspeople, visually isolating and cornering him. Look what happens though when he's framed with the council members, again at the edge of the frame. Here, he is between a rock and a hard place. In the screenplay, there were actually some people on Brody's side arguing for the beaches to be closed. While it might have been a little more realistic, say, for dramatic effect there are no voices supporting him. And I think that was the right way to go. The introduction of Quint in the script was an earlier scene at a music shop when he is buying piano wire. The introduction in the film was far more effective. The scratching of fingernails on a chalkboard, prompting numerous reaction shots in the manner of reveal I alluded to earlier, followed by this slow and long push-in. It holds such gravity, we will remember him without question. After Brody is frightened out of his shark research by his wife, he reacts to the fact that his son is in a boat. He shouts to his son that he should get out of the boat, while his wife argues that it's his birthday tomorrow and Brody shouldn't be so scared because he's not in the water. Look carefully at this shot. When there are two opposing points of view in a Spielberg film, he will often separate the characters visually, as he has done here with the beam between them. Here is a scene from Schindler's List that is a more sophisticated example of this. When Goethe and Schindler are arguing, they are visually separated in different windows. Notice how when a point of agreement is reached, they are no longer separated. When Brody's wife sees the painting of a shark attacking a boat and she shouts at their son to get out of the boat, her head crosses the beam. Very subtle, but there will be more obvious examples of visual separation later. Next, two fishermen decide to try and bait the shark from a dock at night. There are a series of close-ups cut in here of Brody flipping through pages of a book, displaying some horrifying images. I always felt that these shots were actually shot with the intention that they open this earlier scene. I was delighted to discover when I read the screenplay for the first time a few nights ago that this presumption was correct. The editorial decision to insert these shots instead into the dock scene was a masterstroke, further intensifying the scene by exempling horrific injuries that our fishermen may suffer or worse. So when a dock is ripped apart and one of the fishermen is dragged out into the water, those images are still fresh in our mind. And the fact that the shark is strong enough to destroy the dock implies its sheer size, something in the realm of the size of shark whose teeth we've just had illustrated to us perhaps. In classic fashion, we cut back and forth between a fisherman swimming towards what dock is still intact and a slice of dock bearing down on him. The cutting quickens, the shots get closer as Charlie struggles to get out of the water.
No, 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 no. Oh my gosh, I hate everything.
Of course, immediately after this frantically cut scene, the next scene begins with another oneer, as we return to the slower cutting pace I mentioned earlier. This scene introduces the character of Matt Hooper, who from the off demonstrates his aptitude for boating.
Don't race sail, you're just gonna luff it. You got a paddle on the boat? So scull it out of here.
Ironically, the actor Richard Dreyfuss couldn't actually drive a boat, at least when they were filming this scene, which is why the script features him driving a boat here, while what we ended up with was simply him stepping off the boat. After Hooper examines the remains of Chrissy and the wrong shark is caught and photographed, Mrs. Kintner approaches Brody and slaps him, prompting the whole dock to fall silent for dramatic effect. She tells him that she just found out that a girl was killed last week, and yet Brody still allowed people to go into the water. Often I hear reactors blaming the mayor for that choice in this scene, but I'd argue the choice to concede to the will of the mayor was Brody's. Points to a weakness in his character, so let's talk about his character for a moment. In the screenplay during this scene, the mayor explains that the reason they hired an off-islander for the sheriff role was that he wasn't somebody's cousin or brother or son, as he likely would have been had they hired an islander. It was so the sheriff wouldn't be biased in the application of the law, essentially. The fact that Brody isn't an islander, at least in his mind, means that he may not be sensitive to the wants and needs of the people here. Conscious of this danger that the mayor does use to manipulate him, Brody wants to be accepted in his role and by the islanders. He allows himself, therefore, to be swayed. As much as I would like to throw 100% of the blame on the mayor's shoulders, had Brody been more concerned about safety than his own position in the community, I do believe he could have had the beaches closed earlier. Brody believes that also, which is why he walks away guilt-ridden after the confrontation with Mrs. Kintner. That confrontation marks what we call plot point 1. That is the event in a story that propels it from Act 1 to Act 2. That slap and dressing down by Mrs. Kintner and Brody's reaction to it send the narrative in a different direction, prompted by the protagonist making different decisions than they would have in the first act. Of course, that's called character development, often an alien concept in many films today, it must be said. So after a heartwarming moment between Brody and his son, Hooper arrives at Brody's home. He tells the story of how he first became interested in sharks. This wasn't in the script. It simply reads, he tells a story about his boyhood and a shark. So this story was improvised. There's a number of moments like this in the screenplay, requesting that actors ad-lib this or that. Brody's wife informs us about his hydrophobia. His hydrophobia will serve to make Brody the unlikeliest of heroes against the shark. They would similarly use the arachnophobia of Jeff Daniels' character to set him up as the unlikeliest hero against spiders in the film Arachnophobia, a film which uses so many of the tropes of Jaws, it's basically the same story with spiders. So after learning about his hydrophobia, a slightly intoxicated Brody suggests they go and cut the shark open. While the mayor didn't say they couldn't cut the shark open, just that he didn't want it done on a dock in front of everyone, his wife is nevertheless concerned about whether the action is within protocol. His response is steadfast and without caution, nonchalant about any consequences that may result from that action. It is a hint of that character development I was talking about earlier. Brody and Hooper discover that the shark is most certainly not the shark before they go out in a boat, in a scene that was doubtless shot in a studio wave tank. We learn that Hooper is wealthy in an amusing dialogue exchange that I presume was improvised by the actors. The script's version of this exchange was frankly boring expositional dialogue. Then we have the gradual discovery of Ben Gardner's boat, first picking out debris in the water by torchlight to build our anticipation for the reveal. Now I have to say that quite uncharacteristically, I agree with reactors about Matt Hooper's choice to enter the water here.
He's not getting in the water, is he?
I think he is. I thought he was the voice of reason.
I don't...
Also, uncharacteristically, I think the screenplay's version of this scene is more convincing. While Hooper is dismissive of Brody's concerns in the film, the script doesn't have him respond at all to Brody telling him to be careful, and it uses words like warily when describing Hooper's actions in the water. At the first test screenings for Jaws, it was extremely well received. Universal Studios were more than happy with the result. Spielberg wasn't though. I imagine it's because the discovery of Ben Gardner's head was how it was described in the screenplay. Hooper looks up, Ben Gardner's face stares out through a hole in the flicker. Audiences didn't jump, it was an ineffective scare. Believing he could really startle people here, Spielberg would spend $3,000 of his own money to create a mock-up of the boat's underside in Ed DeVerna Fields' pool, hiring a stand-in for Dreyfuss so he could shoot Ben Gardner's head popping out into the hole. Next, he would take a number of people into the editing booth, testing the scare on them, refining the timing of the scare to perfection. The result, as I'm sure you'll agree, is one of the most effective jump scares in movie history.
Oh my gosh!
The scene where Brody and Hooper try to convince Mayor Vaughn once again to close the beaches consists of 3 shots, the most impressive of which is this one, which is actually almost 3 minutes long. Now you may have seen my video Dissecting Halloween. In it I said those 3 minutes of continuous film in the opening was an amazing feat. I would say the same thing about the one in this scene. The blocking, rehearsal, rigging, how every time the characters stop, it's into a perfectly pre-composed shot. This isn't a Steadicam. The camera is on a track and dolly, relying on actors hitting their mark and the camera operator, including whoever is pushing the camera along the dolly, being perfectly timed to arrive at each stage of the scene. In the next scene, following the montage, we get a news anchor on the beach speaking to camera. In the script, this was an elaborate affair involving 3 broadcast cameras and a TV director. Spielberg simplified this just by having the actors interviewed directly to the film camera. Incidentally, the announcer here is Peter Benchley, the author of the novel and co-writer of the screenplay. Another thing handled differently from the script was the appearance of the apparent shark fin in the water. In the screenplay, it is spotted first by the helicopter and then the Coast Guard. That was a very impersonal or detached manner of introducing the apparent threat. Instead, Spielberg shows we, the audience, first, then holds on 2 reactions of people in the water. The scene slowly builds to pandemonium as everyone in the water scrambles for the beach. We witness most of this with the camera at the surface level of the water, immersing us in the drama as though we are in the water. About a quarter of this film is presented from the surface of the water. After a few wider, calmer shots to relieve the tension following the fake fin reveal, we finally get our first glimpse of the shark as a girl spots it, heading for the pond. We are 1 hour and 1 minute into the film, and this is the first time we actually see the shark. The shark theme, which you might notice was absent from the hoax portion of the scene, slowly builds as Brody's anxiety builds. In the script, Brody doesn't even become aware of the attack in the pond until after the victim is eaten. Given that Brody's son is in the pond, this would have been a terrible mistake, which of course Spielberg is aware of. In order for us to truly be involved, Brody needs to know that his son is in danger when he is in danger, not after he's in danger. That's ridiculous. This event is plot point 2. The third act will take up half of the film, which is unusual to be fair. By convention, Act 3 usually covers 1/4 to 1/3 of the film. At the end of this scene, Brody stands and faces the water. Symbolically, this is a protagonist versus antagonist face-off, much like this scene in Rocky IV. Now, before you say that he is not actually facing the shark, consider that by the way the water has been presented through the film, that we are anxious about the shark whenever there is water on screen, the water has become a motif for the shark. It's also there a face-off between man and nature, because that's essentially what we have here, a man versus nature story in the classic sense. There are a number of stages to this man versus nature conflict, so let's take a look at how that is represented visually through the film before we move into the third act. In the opening scene, Chrissy enters the fringe of the shark's territory, the water just off the coast, and pays for this with her life. In the scene we've just looked at, the shark enters the fringe of human territory to kill, not stopping at the coast, but crossing a boundary that humans have set up in the water. Soon, Brody, Hooper, and Quint will respond to this by travelling beyond the fringe of the coast, driving deep into the sea, which is the shark's territory. At which point, the boundaries will change somewhat from horizontal to vertical. Attaching barrels to the shark, the humans try to bring the shark up into their territory. The shark will attack the boat, causing leaks, bringing the humans closer to its territory. Hooper will eventually be lowered into that territory. The shark will respond by attacking a human territory in order to kill Quint. The boat will start sinking, bringing Brody closer to its territory. In the end, man and shark will face off on the surface of the water, the boundary between territories. Is that clear? Good. Let's move on. Brody gets the mayor to sign the form permitting the hiring of Quint to kill the shark, in a scene that clearly demonstrates Brody's further character development. In contrast to his behaviour in the presence of the mayor at the beginning of the film, he controls and dominates the mayor in this scene. He tells the mayor what's going to happen. He doesn't plead his case like in this scene, he just tells him what he's going to do. In the next scene, Quint is framed high above Hooper and Brody to reflect his self-perceived superiority over them, particularly Hooper, whom he doesn't want to at all. He tests Hooper with knots and challenges his seaworthiness. It's always a good idea for characters to contrast each other in various ways. This will make much of the dialogue combative. Combative dialogue is more interesting for the audience to listen to. If Brody, Hooper and Quint were very similar characters, then the dialogue between them would be flat, expositional dialogue. It also increases the drama, and I shouldn't have to tell you that drama is necessary, the more the better, in any story you can tell, in order to keep the reader reading or the viewer watching. There has to be conflict or there is no story. Of course, Quint and Hooper are not the only differing characters, as clearly illustrated when Brody arrives at the dock in waterproofs and his wife asks him if he's packed his Dramamine. We already know that Brody is afraid of the water, so he is going to be a fish out of water on the boat, pun intended. You may remember I mentioned earlier that there would be more obvious examples of visual separation in the film to come. When Hooper and Quint talk on a dock, they are separated by this rope. In fact, this will continue, with Spielberg employing this method to separate these characters right up until this scene, when they will begin to bond. Brody's wife's separation anxiety is focused on at the end of this scene to further her anxiety for him. While Hooper's family is only briefly mentioned, aside from a visual suggestion that he has a wife, we have no idea if he has children. Quint, we can all presume, is a lone wolf, given how he talks about women in particular. The strong concentration on Brody's family through much of the first two acts helps us identify with him more than the other two characters. The rest of the film was shot on the actual ocean, one of a mere few films set on the ocean to actually do this. Spielberg's reasoning for filming it that way was that he wanted to isolate the characters, with the horizon all the way around, so there was no sign of potential escape from the environment when the worst events took place. Except these two shots we will see later, for some reason that eludes me. As I mentioned earlier, this was one of the decisions that led to the film going way over budget, almost causing Spielberg to be fired. When filming, yachts would often interrupt shots and they would have to wait for them to leave the horizon. By the time they had disappeared, the filming boats had often drifted out of position, or the sun was at a different angle, screwing up continuity. By the time the shot was prepared again, there was often another yacht on the horizon that they would have to wait for. Remember, this was before the digital age, so they couldn't just remove those boats in post like we can do today. Spielberg said in interviews some 20 years later that he still wakes up from nightmares that he still hasn't finished this film. The lessons were not learned by 1995 when Kevin Reynolds and Kevin Costner would opt to film on the ocean also for Waterworld, a film whose budget once more ballooned spectacularly for the same reason. Fairly early on in the next scene, Brody pulls the wrong line, setting free the air tanks. Obviously, this is to set up what will become Brody's solution for killing the shark in the climax, but it also further demonstrates Brody's ineptitude in the environment he is now. Something pulls on the line, which Quint presumes is the shark, and Hooper tells him it's not. I've heard so many reactors take the side of Quint in this argument. I'm here to tell you those people are wrong. How do I know? Because the shark's theme is entirely missing from this scene. It can't be the shark. Once again, Quint is on high in the scene that follows, master of all he surveys. Kudos to the camera operator here, who appears to have risked his life and limb dangling precariously from the top of the mast to obtain this shot handheld. Now we're up to the shark's appearance. After a series of shots of mundane activity, we hold on a shot of Brody chumming long enough to settle into it. Back in 1975, if a character swore on screen, it would usually inspire laughter from the audience. Brody does say,
"Come on down and chum some of this shit."
Immediately prior to the shark's emergence would have made people laugh and gasp at the sight of the shark. The shock is intensified by the contrasting laughter. During the test screening, audiences jumped out of their seat at this moment. This was the first jump scare of the film after all. The effect of Spielberg going back and inserting the earlier jump scare with Ben Gardner's head was to dampen this jump scare somewhat. It still works, but not as well as it did when the audience weren't wary of jump scares, since none had happened yet. We are given an idea of the scale of the shark when it passes the orca, the boat itself, Quint and Brody in the foreground. I imagine that was a very difficult shot to block on boats. I've never really understood exactly what Hooper is doing in this scene, and the screenplay didn't make it any clearer. He appears to be adding a device to the barrel that can presumably aid them to track the shark, yet tracking the shark using that device never actually comes up. Its only function seems to be to increase the drama of that first harpoon shot from Quint, and to further illustrate the rivalry between them. When the first barrel sinks, this is not entirely surprising to us. Quint did tell us earlier that he once had to use 2 barrels for a 13-foot tiger shark. What always surprised me about this scene was how it ends. A dissolve shot when Brody is in mid-sentence to Quint, whistling as the sun goes down. It was almost as puzzling as this cut in Poltergeist.
Except that you can breathe. And you're getting pulled along and maybe
Hi, Ben.
No, I didn't cut that. That's how it was in the film. The script did give me a clue about that editing choice. There was another line from Quint that reads, "You hired me, remember? It's my $10,000. It's my shark." It's only a clue though. I have no answers. The dissolve kind of works, but still feels quite awkward. Surprising to see such an awkward edit in a film that won the Oscar for Best Editing. So the next scene is the first scene where Quint and Hooper aren't visually separated, and the characters move closer and closer together as they compare scars, having found a parallel between each other that adds a little mutual respect. They call this proxemics. In drama, that's the use of space between actors to communicate the relationship. Here is Denzel Washington's character when speaking to Tom Hanks's character at the start of Philadelphia, when Denzel's character is full of ignorance about AIDS and homosexuality. And here they are at the end of Philadelphia when he understands how ignorant he was. Here is Michelle Williams and Paul Dano as husband and wife in The Fabelmans, and here they are later when their marriage is on the rocks. Now we reach Quint's speech about the Indianapolis, a frightening story that I understand came from writer John Milius. A true story that barely anyone had heard until it was told in this film. I often hear people saying that Robert Shaw was drunk when he delivered this monologue. I hate to disappoint everyone, but that isn't exactly true. It is true that he fully intended to deliver it drunk, that they did shoot the scene once with him drunk. It's also true that he entirely screwed up the delivery, so they filmed it again when he was sober. I surmise that this shot was the only portion of the scene in the final film where Shaw was drunk. How do I know this? Well, it was shot at a different time from the other shots. Look at the continuity error in the placement of Hooper in the background. Since they only shot it twice, therefore, this shot has to have been filmed when he was drunk. While our heroes all bond singing "Show Me the Way to Go Home," the shark returns to attack the boat. Reactors generally remark how calm Quint is when telling Brody to put out the fire. What they seem to entirely miss is that Quint deliberately knocked the lamp to cause a fire in order to distract Brody from using the radio. Later, Quint will smash the radio with a baseball bat, which causes confusion for people watching the film for the first time today.
Why'd he do that?
Would it make it clearer if I were to explain that $10,000 in 1975 is the equivalent of $54,000 today? Perhaps that missing line from Quint I mentioned earlier was necessary. Perhaps viewers are less intelligent than Spielberg gives them credit for, and do need it spelled out in the dialogue, that Quint is driven to the action of smashing the radio in order to protect his bounty on the shark. In the morning, when a barrel pops up, we will witness Quint's first signs of fear of the shark when he doesn't take his own advice that he just delivered to Hooper, instead freezing and getting his own hands injured in the process. I can only assume that Brody saw Quint's fear too, since he is prompted at that moment to go for the radio again. After the radio is smashed, removing all hope of rescue, Quint and Hooper demonstrate how far they've come since they first met, efficiently readying themselves as a team to attach another barrel to the shark far more quickly than they managed the last one. Cue the high-spirited, adventurous music that always hits when they are chasing down the shark. The function of this music is to contrast the dark, foreboding music whenever danger might be imminent, thereby intensifying the effect of that music. If the whole film was dark, foreboding music, then its effect would be diluted. After Quint manages to attach 2 barrels to the shark, and Quint reacts befuddled to its once again taking those barrels down, the barrels pop back up and they tie the ropes to the stern cleats. Hooper nearly losing his legs here isn't in the script, but it was another great illustration of Brody's maritime ignorance. Quint manages to attach a 3rd barrel to the shark before the orca is dragged, and Quint pulls out a machete to cut the rope. I was always puzzled before reading the screenplay exactly why there's a close-up of the machete here. In the script though, when the shark launches itself onto the boat, Quint lifts the machete and charges at the shark before losing his footing and falling into the shark's mouth. I can understand why that was likely changed. Quint is afraid of the shark by this point, so the idea he would so readily attack the shark in such a manner may have seemed contrary to his emotional state. If you're wondering why they left the shot in, it's because this shot and this shot won't cut together without creating a jump cut. So it was for continuity reasons that the close-up of the lance was left in. The shark breaks free, and once again, despite Quint's insistence that it can't go under with 3 barrels, it goes under. We hold on the bewildered expression of Quint. This is no ordinary shark. In some ways, this reminds me of 1978's Halloween, which my last video was about. If you've not seen that film yet, skip to the time on screen now. Are you gone? Good. In Halloween, Michael Myers rises each time we expect him to die, just like the shark in Jaws sinks every time we expect him to stay at the surface. In both cases, the threat defies our understanding and the understanding of the characters. They are both anomalies of nature. Quint decides to start heading towards land, but he pushes the damaged engine to breaking point. Why? Once again, he's scared. He does his best to cover this up with anger, but he's definitely scared to death of the shark by this point. When the engine blows and the boat sits listing in the water, Quint finally decides to ask Hooper what he might be able to do with his equipment. Now, this may look like some character development on his part, but frankly, he is out of options anyway, so I'm not sure that counts. The 3 men construct the shark cage with uplifting music once again to offset the more ominous music that will follow. Then Hooper is lowered beneath the surface. The script cuts back and forth between the surface and Hooper, but Spielberg opts to keep us immersed, quite rightly I think. Intercut with the mechanical shark footage in this scene is real footage of an actual shark, shot by Ron and Valerie Taylor in Australia. The camera is cranked up for slow motion to scale up its movements. The cage is smaller, and the idea was to have a little person in a miniature cage to represent Hooper. I'm not sure any of the shots of the diver in the cage or the little person in question actually. I know that this shot was entirely accidental, when a shark became entangled with the cage and had to wriggle its way free. Spielberg was delighted with the footage, though upset to see that the little person wasn't in the cage. Up until this point, the plan was to actually kill Hooper off, just like in a novel. This footage prompted a rewrite where Hooper escapes the cage and ultimately survives. A good thing too, Richard Dreyfuss's performance as Hooper truly endears the character to the audience. I think it would have been most upsetting to us if he had died. After the cage is dropped, the shark launches itself spectacularly onto the rear of the boat. Now, this shot is the most obvious special effect in the whole film. If you were to watch this shot, and even the death of Quint as an individual clip on YouTube, you might scoff and say the shark looks fake. As many people said about Jaws, largely driven by the sequels through the 1980s.
The shark still looks fake.
However, in the context of the whole film, and with the level of involvement we feel, particularly in Brody's survival, we're usually not so critical. Quint goes the way of Herbie Robinson from Cleveland, but not before reminding us about the air tanks, for the 3rd time, as though Spielberg was so afraid that the solution for killing the shark might be read as Deus Ex Machina. With Quint gone and the boat sinking, the shark bursts through the window of the Orca, bringing man and beast eye to eye. Now, the shark roars here, which may seem a little ridiculous to anyone who knows anything about sharks. They have no organs to produce sound, but I do understand the creative choice here. You have this huge tooth-lined mouth yawning open, threatening Brody. If it were a lion or tiger, we'd expect it to roar. Given that most people have never experienced a face-to-face encounter with a shark, the audience might expect to hear a roar. And it's great for dramatic effect. Think of all the sound effects of spaceships flying and lasers firing in Star Wars. Anyone who knows anything about physics knows that you need air in order to produce sound, and there is no air in space. However, the need to use sound for dramatic effect, as well as the presumed ignorance of most kids watching about physics, kind of excuses that. Remember, it's a film, not reality. Just like people who complain that sharks don't behave like they do in Jaws. They do in this story world. Suspend your disbelief or go watch something else would be my advice. Brody takes a rifle and climbs the mast. Williams gives us a riff of heroic music as he prepares to battle a monster mono a mono. The idea to blow up the shark in the end wasn't Spielberg's idea, but rather filmmaker friends of his who all told him that if he was going to carry the audience for 2 hours, he had to think of some way of blowing it up. It couldn't just die from its injuries as it was originally scripted. The author, Peter Benchley, was dead against this idea. He thought audiences would think the ending too contrived and incredible. In fact, I understand he actually had to be banned from the set, given how vocal he was in his opposition to this idea. It wouldn't be until the film was a resounding success that he would admit he was wrong. Jaws was released on June 20th, 1975, and would go on to earn $272 million in the US alone from a $12 million budget. To give you an idea how successful that was back then, it sold 30 million more tickets in the US than Avengers Endgame. You may have heard that Endgame was the most successful film in history. That doesn't take into account ticket price inflation. In fact, the marketing in 1975 touted Jaws as the most successful film in film history, but again, that wasn't taking ticket price inflation into account. They never do. In fact, the film that sold the most tickets in the US was Gone with the Wind in 1939, but comparing films in different times isn't fair either, given that the market fluctuates depending on a number of factors. Few people had TVs in 1939. No one could stream films in 1975, so the conditions of the market change over time. I always roll my eyes whenever the marketing for a film claims that their film is the most successful in history. It's never true. Jaws was the most successful film of its time. That is really all you can say with any element of truth. This film would skyrocket Steven Spielberg's career, and he's barely looked back since, making hit after hit, with a couple of duds to be fair. His films were the films that prompted my passion for film, so I can only hope that this video does this film justice. Let me know in the comments your thoughts about Jaws, how you first encountered the film, as well as anything you might know about it that I haven't included. This is not a comprehensive overview. I had to cut this video down considerably because of how long it was getting, but I suppose I signed up for that when I chose to tackle a film from my favourite filmmaker. My next video in this series will be on one of the most effective action films ever, in my opinion, 1982's First Blood. Once again, a quick shout out to my favourite reaction channel, Popcorn in Bed, whose reactions were referenced in this video. There is a link to their channel below. Like this video if you like it, and subscribe if you're interested in seeing more content like this. I've been Francis X Lord. Thanks for listening. Ciao for now.